Every game has complexity that it kind of puts on the player that the player has to understand and interpret. And I think it's really worthwhile to think through how you manage the cognitive load that you put onto players. When you give them more information, how you give them more information to make sure that you don't paralyze them. This matters in all games, of course, but I think it particularly matters in board games because in board games, card games, any sort of non digital game, you are responsible not only for being a player, but also for implementing all of the game logic, which is a big deal, right? Like in a digital game, you might have like a bot or a villain or whatever who's like has all of this AI logic and all this maybe probability of what they do next. And the player doesn't really have to understand how all of that works. They just need to fight the villain. But in this board game that we're working on, we have these little monsters who move around the board called beasts. And players are responsible for moving them, which means they need to intuitively understand how and why and when they move because they're responsible for implementing that game logic. And so there's this question of like, how do you introduce that complexity to them? How do you give them those rules in a way that will work for them and will not overwhelm them and paralyze them as they have to understand it and then also make decisions as a player? I've been thinking about this kind of on three, I don't know, axes or spectra, whatever. Is that the plural of spectrum? Ask me again tomorrow. I may have more, I may think differently about this, but this is how I think about it today. So one of them is like how much visual complexity, how much information you give people to read. Second is like, what is the field of possibility? How much could happen in this game? And the third is how much can I as a player do right now? So let's break these down with something really familiar like chess. In chess, the visual complexity, the visual information is essentially just what's on the board. What are the position of pieces on the board? Which there's some complexity, but you can kind of read it, not quite at a glance, but a little bit more than a glance. Contrast this with something like a board game that has lots of cards with lots of numbers and letters and symbols and tons of stuff all over the board, which has very high visual complexity or information complexity. The second is this sort of like field of possibility of what could happen in the medium or long term future. In chess, famously, this is nearly infinite, right? As you look out at what could happen in the next turn or the next couple turns, there's a pretty good number of permutations. But as you look at it, like what could happen in the next 10 or 20 turns, what could happen before the end of the game, it's nearly infinite, which is where all the difficulty and complexity of chess comes from. And lastly is what can I do as a player right now? And on your turn in chess, actually, this is fairly limited. You don't have a massive number of options. You certainly don't have an infinite number of options. You could move one piece and sometimes you can't even move every piece on the board. You gradually have fewer pieces on the board. So that's actually not where chess's complexity comes from. It all comes from this like field of possibility question. I think this is a really interesting framework to think about games. Like if you were to turn all three of those dials up all the way, you would get EVE Online or something, a game with an enormous amount of information that you could read and look at and interpret, an enormously large, possibly infinitely large field of possibilities of where the game might go next. And then, of course, what can I do right now as a player is also ramped up to 1,000,000 because it's like there's so many things you can do as a player and there's so many orders in which you could do those things. And so what you get when you ramp up all those things to, a 10 is a super complex game that is like not a mass market game. It's like a hardcore hobbyist game, like Terraforming Mars or something like that. On the flip side of it, if you turn all of them down, you basically get Candyland, right? There's like nothing interesting to look at on the board. The field of possibility of what you can do is extremely small, and really your player actions, you're not even choosing what you do. There's almost nothing that you can do. It's like you're just drawing cards and they tell you what to do. It's almost not even a game, right? So it's interesting to see like where do games fall on those spectrum, and if you're going to be somewhere in the middle, if you're going for kind of a normal average mid-market game that's like going to actually reach people, how do you manage that? Does it mean that you need to have all three of those dials be at 5? It could. Like, I think Dominion arguably is there. It's like all three of those dials are somewhere around the middle. But I think that there's other interesting ways of approaching it, and that's what I want to talk about today. First, with a game that we played this weekend. So this is Seven Wonders. This is one of my favorite board games. You can see the box is pretty beat up because we've played this about 1 billion times. Seven Wonders is a medium complexity game, and it is pretty big and successful. And it's not as if they just turned every single dial to 5. So what they did is, if you look at people playing Seven Wonders and you've never played it before, and you see the table with all of these cards, with all of these symbols and different colors, and there's 1 million cards on the table, it looks like a really complex game because there's so much visual noise. There's a lot of symbols to understand, and the amount of information, if you wanted to just like read everything and keep up with what every player is doing, there's an enormous amount of information available to you as a player. That is fairly high complexity. The field of possibility is also decently large. I mean, it's not as large as, I don't know, chess or EVE Online, but there's a lot of things that can happen in Seven Wonders, and there's a lot of ways it could play out. But the saving grace of it, the reason why it's not just a hardcore hobbyist high complexity game, is because the third kind of area of complexity, the player actions, is extremely limited. You're just handed a hand of cards, and it's like pick one and then pass the rest to the left. The actual action that you take as a player is severely limited. When you get those cards, often also there's like 2 or 3 of them that you obviously don't want or can't even afford. So it's really like choose between like 2 or 3 cards, which is a choice that is like much more approachable than it might seem. And so they can get away with having like high visual complexity, high number of permutations of how the game can play out, because the player actions are actually so straightforward that you learn it once and you never have to learn it again. I think that's one way of approaching this that's really interesting, is like, turning the knobs to different levels, right? I also think that another way of approaching this, and this is something that I've been thinking a lot about in the games I'm working on right now, is to gradually reveal complexity instead of dumping it all on the player at once. So, for example, we made this game years ago, Pecking Order. It's this like social game that was really crazy and had some wild complexity and interesting stuff going on in it. And the way that we designed it is that all of the complexity is laid bare to the player right away. And you kind of have to read this like 3-4 page rule book before you even get started. And it was like not totally clear to new players what was going on. There was just so many things going on in the game. You have to take this quiz and do this challenge, and you're getting tokens to buy these advantages, and all the advantages you can buy are like available to you right from the jump. And it was just way too much information for the player to digest. And most people didn't really have a sense of how to play the game until they had played a couple games already, which is fine. It's not the end of the world, but that's really not what we were aiming for. We were aiming for something a lot more lightweight than that. And the way that I solved this when I rebuilt Pecking Order in the social game is that I changed it so that the rules that you have to understand at the beginning are truly all you have to understand is you need to be at the top of the scoreboard. You're going to vote every round. You can upvote people and downvote people, and they'll move on the scoreboard. All other complexity you'll learn along the way, right? So we're going to give you a series of challenges, and each challenge will come with like, hey, here's a little rule that twists what you know about the game. Here's a way you can earn some hidden points. Here's a way you could spend those hidden points. That's that. It's like approachable. It's just a couple sentences. The player goes, that's interesting. And then next challenge, we give them something else, right? So we still have all of this interesting stuff in the game, but you don't have to understand it at the jump. We basically are giving you almost like tutorials that are like just in time, right? Video games are really good at this. Like Mario doesn't explain to you everything about how the physics of jumping on stuff works. They don't tell you about how every enemy works. They teach you about that enemy right when you get to them. Or Zelda doesn't teach you everything about how to explore Hyrule. It like just kind of gradually opens up to you and unfolds and gives you these like implicit tutorials along the way. And that is a much more approachable, good way to learn the game. I'm trying this also in a couple other projects, like the digging game right now. The rules, this board game that I'm making of where you go around and dig, the rules are extremely simple, and the actions that are available to you at the beginning are very, very simple. And there are super interesting things that come up, but they come up when you get specific cards and add them to your hand, and then you start going like, this is interesting. This is a little different than I thought. And so the complexity is able to grow over time, and the things that you find when you're digging make the game quite a bit more interesting. But the rules you need to know up front are very simple, and the complexity about the things you find are on the card when you get them, so we can like teach you how to use them right when you find them. And that allows you to basically teach the game in a way that says, here's the one pager on how you move around this board and how you take your turn. Everything else you can learn along the way. I really like this style of game design, and I'm trying to use it more and more. I'm doing this also right now in this crazy new thing I'm adding to the social game, which is this huge full-blown farming simulation that can host like hundreds of people in it. And I'm trying to basically make a board game that can accommodate hundreds of people at a time. But like right when you get dropped in, it's just like, yeah, you can move, you can upgrade your character a little bit, but the number of actions you have is extremely confined. And if you play the game seriously over the course of the week, it'll kind of blossom in front of you and a lot more interesting things will come to light. But right when you start the game, it's very simple. It's very straightforward. We're going to hide most of the complexity from you. Trying this out. We'll see how it goes.